All for All is a podcast produced by me, Richard R.J. Eskow, in collaboration with Democracy at Work. We explore history, science, culture, and more to imagine what a post-capitalist world might look like and how we might get there. This podcast is founded on the belief that our technological imaginations have outraced our social imaginations, leaving us at the mercy of the exploitative few. And since we're using our imaginations, this week we're going to swing for the fences and try to see if we can imagine a world where humanity actually puts an end to war. Now, what got me thinking about it was last weekend's Memorial Day holiday, which my first thought was we have a holiday for soldiers who didn't survive the war they fought in. We have a holiday for soldiers who did survive in Veterans Day. That's two holidays for soldiers, one for those who die, one for those who survive. Now, I should say my family included both, and I have great respect for the tradition of honoring both. But the fact is, we don't have any holidays dedicated to anyone else who sacrifices for society. I mean, I suppose Labor Day is supposed to do that, but we don't talk about working people on Labor Day. And it used to drive me nuts, for example, when Joe Biden was president at the height of the COVID pandemic, and he would end every speech with saying, "God bless our troops." I'm fine with that sentiment, but never once, "God bless our medical workers who were going out there without personal protection and equipment, endangering their lives, working under horrific conditions to try to save the rest of us." Never once, "God bless our teachers who are working under horrendous circumstances." "God bless our frontline retail workers who are getting food and other necessities to us," or the truck drivers who were shipping goods to us under sometimes very difficult circumstances. And I guess while we're talking about holidays, last note, and we'll elaborate on this more in a bit, but of course, Veterans Day used to be called Armistice Day, celebrating the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. It was changed, I believe, in 1953 on the suggestion of a citizen in the Midwest to the broader Veterans Day. And of course, armistice is a peace agreement. So we stopped celebrating a peace settlement and just started celebrating people who fought the wars instead, which on one hand, I get it, because the Treaty of Versailles, there's much to criticize about it, but Americans under Woodrow Wilson believed falsely that it was a great resolution, that it not only instituted peace, but a Pax Americana, where the United States could dictate terms to the rest of the world on how it would operate, who would get democracy and who wouldn't, and so on. What came out of the end of World War II was a divided planet and the seeds of the Cold War. So I get that they didn't want to celebrate that, but we were left with no celebration of peace, two celebrations of war. Now, people will say, and we'll go back over this a little bit, but of course, people will say the idea of ending war is absolutely utopian and absurd. They'll say humans have always fought wars and always will. And I have two initial responses to that, and then we'll go back and look at it a little more closely. But first of all, using our imaginations again, the philosopher G.A. Cohen made the case for short socialism in a short book by saying it's a natural instinct of people to behave socialistically when they organize themselves. For example, he used the metaphor of a camping trip. When people go on a camping trip, they share their resources and they share the work and they collaborate and they make decisions jointly. Well, I would argue you could write a similar book, maybe I will, about war, because the fact is, use an example. I have a neighbor several neighbors, people living in the same house, appear to be a number of grown men, but they do work on cars and other large equipment in the driveway, and sometimes it gets noisy and it annoys the other neighbors. So there's been a little conversation. What should we do about it? Never once has it occurred to anybody in the neighborhood that we should get together, form an army, invade that house, drive them out or kill them, and restore peace and tranquility that way. The fact is, war is not fundamental to human nature. We've just been told it is. But we'll get back to the history of war, and I just want to make a point also that if it seems absurd to you to think about a world without war, remember that until a couple hundred years ago or so, it seemed absurd to most people on this planet to imagine a world without slavery, whether it was total bondage of the horrific kind we saw in the Americas, whether it was debt servitude, bonded labor. Slavery was a facet of human life that could be traced back 11,000 years to the invention of agriculture. So people insisted, some with regret and some celebrating it as the natural order, that slavery would never end. Aristotle, some 2,000 plus years ago, said that slavery would end, quote, when looms run themselves. Now, that's the economics explanation for slavery's end, and we could look at economic explanations for the end of war too. But it's worth bearing in mind that Aristotle was a racist dick of the first order. He argued that some people were natural slaves, slaves by nature, he said, and that it was better for them to be ruled. He was like any racist plantation owner anywhere. Most human beings, either certainly of the ruling classes and the slave owner classes, felt something similar, or they thought, gee, it's a shame, but that's what they have to do. There were few exceptions. The Greek Stoics believed that it was against natural law to enslave other human beings, but the religion professor Jonathan A.C. Brown calls these moral and economic arguments a feedback loop. They both reinforce each other, and I would argue that we have a similar or reinforced each other. Hopefully, a few people are making that argument now. I would argue that while most people agree war is bad, they kind of accept it fatalistically, and the economic and national interest aspects of the argument are in a feedback loop with the, well, that's just what human nature is. I mean, most people agree nuclear war is really, really bad, but even there, we don't do nearly enough to avoid it. We watch as India and Pakistan go to the brink of nuclear war potentially and do nothing. We accelerate a shocking level of tension between Russia and the West in Ukraine, even when U.S. intelligence agencies report that the chance of Russia using a tactical nuclear weapon in response has risen to 50%. We still think the war machine or the practice of war is just an inevitable and therefore rational part of human nature. As part of our denialism, we overlook the vastness of the war machine. Now, these figures are out of date, but as of 2022, the world spent nearly $3 trillion on direct military spending. Of that, 3/4 of the spending was done by the US and its allies. 3% was done by Russia. I'm sure that's gone up a little bit, maybe 5% now. China, 10%. Now, again, those numbers may have shifted a little bit, but we are caught in the grip of a madness, and the United States is at the heart of it. In fact, of the top 16 countries with the largest military spending in the world, nobody comes anywhere close to what we are. We are more than 7 times the spending of any other country. But why? Why have we had such a history of war in the modern era? Well, war took on a very different nature after the Industrial Revolution, of course. So let's look at the 20th century to begin with. We had World War I, and one of the great ideological battles of the 20th century was, why was World War I fought? The socialist explanation has traditionally, and the left-wing explanation has traditionally been that it was a clash of imperialisms between Germany and Great Britain, with the United States emerging as a surprise sort of dark horse winner at the end, that it was a reflection of class conflict, that it was a war over national self-determination, and so on. There's a lot of merit, I think, to that argument, so much so, in fact, that aspects of it became kind of standard accepted historical interpretation. There was a reaction against that interpretation with a series of books around, 2013, 2014, pushing back against the idea that World War I was a feudal or self-interested war in any way. And this kind of took place in parallel with the political pushback too, especially in Great Britain, because remember, Great Britain was a core player in this. As a historian wrote recently, that the British Tory government in 2014, its education secretary got angry because a comedy show was making fun of upper class British imperialism, and also got mad at the same time at left-wing critics of the war, writing an essay entitled, quote, "Why does the left insist on belittling true British heroes?" And that was so forceful an argument that the then conservative government spent more than 50 million pounds on a propaganda campaign to promote a positive view of Britain's participation in World War I. Now, World War I had been over for more than 70 years, but they still, in fact, more than, 80 years, right? But still, they felt this was a useful expenditure of British resources at a time that they were also imposing austerity on working people and the poor. But the British education minister, while he was a buffoon, made a great point about, inadvertently, about why it was important to do this. He said, quote, "The challenges we face today, great power rivalry, migrant populations on the move, rapid social upheaval, growing global economic independence and interdependence, massive technological change, and fragile confidence in political elites," he says, "are all challenges our forebears faced," quote. And he says they're all threatened, the success of those challenges, by quote, "denigrating virtues such as patriotism, honor, and courage," end quote. He lists very effectively what the forces, some of the factors that the forces pushing war on us are abhorrent toward, or abhor, and are resisting. They want to defeat the other great powers. They want to push out immigrants. They want to suppress social change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So historians signed up, writing books supporting this conservative view, but also there was a group of counter historians on the left, along with artists, intellectuals, and activists, who created the quote unquote "no glory in war" movement to push back on the conservative government's effort to rehabilitate the war. If you want to know more about it, look up the name Axel Fair Schulz. So that was World War I. Then we have World War II, where, as Howard Zinn reports, there's clear evidence that the U.S. wasn't concerned about democracy or justice or independence. When the fascists rebelled in Spain against the elected government, which was kind of socialist liberal, the Roosevelt administration sponsored a neutrality act. So it left the Spanish government without help, even as Hitler and Mussolini were backing the fascist Franco. So he wasn't that concerned about freedom there. He wasn't particularly concerned about the well-being of Jews at first. Wasn't Hitler's initial attacks on Jews that brought the U.S. into World War II. It was not Italy's attack on Ethiopia or Hitler's invasion of Australia or takeover of Czechoslovakia. In fact, in certain cases, he said, he basically argued that some of these countries were acting within their sphere of influence. For example, the open door policy said that the United States in 1917 was a set of notes with Japan that said, quote, the government of the United States recognizes that Japan has special interests in China, end quote. So the brutal invasion of Manchuria originally didn't draw a lot of attention, but what did was the Japanese attack on the American Pacific Empire at Pearl Harbor. As Zinn notes, the Southwest Pacific area was of undeniable economic importance to the United States. At the time, most of America's tin and rubber came from there, as did substantial quantities of other raw materials, end quote. Now, since World War II, which, as I say, did not end with the kind of victory of power that Woodrow Wilson would be inclined to celebrate after World War I, of course, came the series of sad and pathetic and devastating and inhumane little wars that have characterized the United States since then. Vietnam, which of course I shouldn't diminish the terrible loss of life in any of them, the play acting of Grenada, the 22-year futility in Afghanistan, the horrors in Iraq, and of course now, and the culmination of many decades of active genocide and ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians. But again, why? Well, first of all, let's look at something. Let's look at how the United States really behaves in the Middle East when it comes to Israel. It's been said by several people, and I agree, that Israel serves as a kind of aircraft carrier, a base, a source of power, both military and economic. Hence, Donald Trump's push to execute what he called the Abraham Accords, a series of trade agreements with the oil-rich countries of the Middle East, which also creates a trade route through Israel. Of course, the slaughter of the Gazans also raises the possibility of access to offshore oil there. And needless to say, perhaps, President Joe Biden continued Donald Trump's Middle Eastern policies when it came to the Abraham Accords and the economic interests of the wealthy and powerful in the United States and in the West. And Trump is also continuing them in his new role. But there is an interesting kind of sidebar to all this that I think is worth noting, which is the battle over the Red Sea led by the so-called Houthis, the self-described Ansar Allah movement of Yemen. This has been a remarkable illustration of the economic roots of war and how they really operate. For, as you know, the Houthis began, or Ansar Allah began attacking shipping that benefited Israel through the Red Sea, including U.S. shipping, and has done so extraordinarily successfully, causing a temporary but dramatic increase in the cost of shipping. As it goes up, of course, that contributed to the inflation that helped undo the Biden presidency. But not only didn't they tell you that the Israeli backing the Israeli genocide was increasing inflation for you at home, they didn't admit it even within the halls of power. The name of the military operation that the Biden administration put together to try to stop the Houthis was called, and I kid you not, Operation Prosperity Guardian. Now, can you think of a worse term? It was such a bad term that I got diverted at the time into the history of how the Army and other military branches of the military have named their operations over time. But Prosperity Guardian was the counterattacks against we'll call them Houthis for brevity's sake, the counterattacks against the Houthis to restore Red Sea shipping. Now, the one thing that the American people did not feel in 2024 was prosperous. So, whose prosperity were they guarding? And needless to say, probably, I think it's needless to say, the operation was unsuccessful, and the inflationary effects were actually made worse because global shipping was also affected by U.S. sanctions on Chinese imports that disrupted trade flows and so on. So maritime logistics got incredibly complicated, costlier. Now, as things have eased up, the shipping corporations are jacking up prices. And then comes the interesting part. While Donald Trump has not reversed military course in Israel, except for a brief ceasefire, he has surrendered to the Houthis. He, in order to reopen shipping in the Red Sea, well, first what he did was he tried his own Prosperity Guardian, but he called it Operation Rough Rider. You know, the Rough Riders were the group that Teddy Roosevelt was involved with in Cuba. So it was another kind of imperialist self-declaration, but it was a staggering failure, costing God knows how many billions of dollars. It couldn't even develop any kind of air superiority over the Houthis. After 30 days, the Houthis had shot down several drones, fired at naval ships, including an aircraft carrier. $1 billion was spent. Two $67 million F-18 Super Hornets fell off a carrier into the sea. It was an utter embarrassment. So Trump declared victory and gave in and said, if you'll reopen shipping, we'll stop bombing you. So the economics of war dictated that Trump give in. Interestingly and oddly enough, he also complimented the Houthis for their toughness and bravery. I guess that's part of the macho positioning that Trump has got to go through. All in all, what this has done is, I think, first of all, elevated the Houthis' reputation as freedom fighters. There may be plenty to criticize about them. I know there is, but their reputation here has been strengthened in the global South, because it's important to understand that this is a war between the global North and the global South. The latest iteration of the mechanism of war is a North-South divide. It's what the Tricontinental Institute calls hyper-capitalism. A lot of seemingly incomprehensible actions, invading Iraq, Afghanistan, backing Israel's murderous actions, even though for Biden it was political suicide. What's going on? I mean, Manifest Destiny, the Cold War, at least you could kind of get what they were trying to do. But what the Tricontinental Institute calls hyper-imperialism is they call it imperialism conducted in an exaggerated and kinetic way, end quote. Or what I say is, a dying animal is the most dangerous creature of them all, and the same may be true of empires. As the Tricontinental Report says, quote, the United States has lost hegemony in production, though it still has some remaining areas of technological hegemony, I think less since they wrote this last year, including those related to the military. It is seeing its financial hegemony challenged, though still in the very early stages. And I'll just continue without productive power and knowing that its financial power is at a tipping point. The full suite of imperial technologies and control that the US has is no longer at its disposal. Therefore, it's channeling its power through the mechanisms it has left: culture, the control of truth, and war. Now, NATO is an active participant in this, if a somewhat subservient one. The joint declaration of European Union NATO cooperation, which was published in January 2023, includes this sentence, quote, "We will further mobilize the combined sets of instruments at our disposal, be they political, economic, or military, to pursue our common objectives to the benefit of our 1 billion citizens." That's what this is about. The self-interest of, quote unquote, our citizens. But hang on, which citizens? You mean the citizens whose prosperity was being guarded with the war on the Ansar Allah, or the rest of us? That's what this comes down to. War has always been in the interests of the few and against the interests of the many. But is it part of human nature? The science writer John Horgan, who writes or did write for Scientific American, has done an excellent job studying the anthropology and early history of war and violence, and summarizing the case for declaring pretty conclusively that war is not an essential part of human nature. He contrasts Margaret Mead's writings on it with those of psychologist Steven Pinker. Points out that his students and people he talks to, 9 out of 10 say that war is inevitable. Cites the Malthusian argument, which is one archaeologist put it: no matter where we happen to live on Earth, we eventually outstrip the environment, which has always led to competition as a means of survival, with war the inevitable consequence. But as John Horgan points out, analyses of more than 300 societies have turned up no clear-cut correlations between warfare and scarce resources, and that while many conditions are enough for war to occur, none seem to be necessary. There are many societies who have lived without war. He cites many of them. He says that this fatalistic belief that we're bound to have war is wrong empirically. He also points out it's wrong morally because it helps perpetuate war. Now, Republicans have always been a warlike party in this country, but Democrats as well as Republicans have routinely increased the military budget year after year. And we recall, for example, President Barack Obama saying in 2009 that war, quote, appeared with the first man, end quote, and, quote, we will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetimes. But, you go to Oregon, there are all sorts of studies disproving that. As he says, the evidence is overwhelming that war is a relatively recent cultural invention emerging toward the end of the Paleolithic era and then only sporadically. But okay, let's say that we agree that war is not an essential part of human nature and that we have to bring an end to it. How do we do that? Well, the conflict resolution specialist and mathematician Johannes Galtung studied peace studies. He's a founder of peace studies and conflict resolution. And while those things may sound, and structural violence, may have come up with the term, and while those things may sound touchy-feely, he puts a lot of analytical rigor into it. I took a short course in it and found it absolutely fascinating. For a while, I wanted to change my entire career and become a conflict resolution negotiator. A friend said, that's not your strength, Eskow. But Galtung is very, very interesting and good at reconciling the opposing interests of two different nations or groups. But again, it's not, most of these conflicts aren't, especially when it comes to war, aren't as binary as they appear. It's not just US versus Russia, Japan versus China. It's which part of the US society, which part of the US economy versus which part of the Russian economy versus which part of the Ukrainian economy. But if we want to do something about it, we have to kind of extrapolate from all sorts of conflict resolution, but we also have to take the decision making away from the people whose interests are best served by these institutions of war. Now, we could try to restore international law, which has been absolutely violated by the West, most flagrantly during the last and now the current administration. And that's a noble thing to do for sure. And we certainly need to rebuild international institutions like the United Nations. But the United Nations will only be an effective tool if it's not only given the power to work for peace, but if it becomes truly representative of the majority of people around the world, which is to say, not the ruling elites of the countries that belong to it. Last and most importantly, I want to talk about how working people, regular people, ordinary people need to have a global solidarity that says it is insane for us to be fighting for them. This is an old trope from the left, but it still makes sense. This still needs to be the way we need to go. And I think of it as a variation on the consent of the governed, as they say in political science. We have to withdraw the consent of the murdered. The example I like to go to, as I think a lot of people do, is the Christmas truce of 1914 in World War I. Now, the main thing to know about the Christmas truce of 1914 is that it was awesome. Roughly 100,000 soldiers, British and German, were involved in this cessation of violence around Christmas, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, spontaneous. The Germans placed candles on their trenches. They put up Christmas trees. They sang Christmas carols. The British responded by singing Christmas carols too. They then greeted each other, Merry Christmas, and so on. Then, there was a no man's land between them. They started going back and forth, talking, exchanging gifts, food, cigarettes or tobacco, liquor, and that kind of buttons, hats, parts of their uniforms. Nobody was firing, and they allowed each other to collect the bodies of the dead. One of the generals, brigadier generals of England, said that one of his captains, quote, smoked a cigar with the best shot in the German army, end quote, and then added that he, and this from a citation, added that he was reluctant to witness the truce personally for fear of German snipers, because nobody liked the generals in those days, I guess. And this they'd been fighting for about 5 months, but they did things like conduct joint burials. They extended occasionally. There were other sorts of kind of live and let live moments of unofficial ceasefire. And this was something that, of course, greatly disturbed the leadership, the generals and politicians, but provided inspiration, continues to provide inspiration for people around the world. That if we refuse en masse to participate with the machinery of war, war will have to stop. Now, obviously, I'm not doing this whole subject justice given the limited time, but I would add, I started out by talking about human nature and how war and assembling armies is not an instinctive human response to problems. You know what else isn't an instinctive human response? Going out and getting killed. So if people understand that in most cases, sure, there are cases where people have the right and the necessity to defend themselves from oppression, but far rarer than you might think. And if people refuse to participate in the machinery of war will stop. Now, as a last thought, people will say, well, what about that higher sense of purpose that the military offers, that sense of camaraderie, loyalty, unity, patriotism? Well, I agree. I have sometimes envied my relatives who have experienced that and been able to be nurtured by it without seeing the problems in it necessarily. But I would just add that the military is, you could call it socialist. It's certainly government. It's certainly a communal institution. It's way too centralized and hierarchical and violent for my taste, but you could build something very similar that would be available to all, that would provide people with a livelihood and a chance to truly serve the greater good. So why not think and imagine that we could put an end to war? As always, thanks for listening. And as always, I look forward to your comments.